Before the word America was born, there was nothing here but wind, rivers, land masses, and countless nights of gazing up at the stars. The indigenous peoples did not speak of owning the land, they spoke of belonging to it. They fed their children with corn, built cities in the sky on cliff faces, and lived in a world defined by balance and reverence. Until a ship sliced across the horizon, altering the fate of this continent forever. Its birth was accompanied by hope and destruction, in equal measure, by freedom and slavery, hand in hand. To understand this nation, you must first see the other side, buried deep beneath the ground, obscured by the fireworks of celebration. To the Europeans who would later name this land the New World, it was uncharted territory. To the indigenous peoples, it had never been new. In the eastern forests, the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy lived in longhouses, cultivating the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. On the Great Plains of the Midwest, the Sioux and Cheyenne nations followed the migration of the bison herds. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples built multi-story cities into sheer cliff faces. Further south, in the Mississippi River Valley, Cahokia rose, home to the 100-foot-tall Monk's Mound, a structure larger in scale than contemporary London. All these nations shared a profound reverence for the land, entirely unaware that on the other side of the ocean, another world was watching with hungry ambition. On October 12, 1492, everything changed. The Italian navigator, Christopher Columbus, convinced that sailing west would lead him to India, stumbled upon this continent by accident. When he laid eyes on the bronze-skinned indigenous peoples, he stubbornly called them Indians, a name born of misunderstanding, yet one that would be etched forever onto the rightful owners of this land. Columbus's arrival opened Pandora's box. Explorers, conquistadors, and colonists flooded in, bringing not just swords and crosses, but smallpox, measles, and influenza. The indigenous peoples had no immunity to these diseases, and a silent catastrophe began. Historians estimate that in the century after Columbus's arrival, the indigenous population of North America plummeted by 90%, one of the deadliest demographic disasters in human history. The Spanish were the first to act. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida. In 1539, Hernando de Soto led 600 men deep into the interior, marching from Florida to the Mississippi River, leaving death and destruction in his wake. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, is the oldest permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. The French chose a different strategy, venturing deep inland along the St. Lawrence River, trading furs with local tribes, and profiting through alliances and commerce. The British arrived late, only seriously considering colonization of the Americas at the end of the 16th century. In 1587, a group of 117 English colonists arrived on Roanoke Island. 3 years later, every single colonist had vanished without a trace, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a tree. The mystery of the lost colony remains unsolved to this day, a warning from the land to its invaders. But the warning did nothing to stem the tide of ambition. In 1606, the London Virginia Company received a charter from King James I of England, with a goal of finding gold in the New World. In May 1607, 105 colonists founded Jamestown on the banks of the James River. It was a disastrous choice. The land was swamp-ridden, infested with mosquitoes, and malaria and dysentery cut down the settlers like the Grim Reaper. Most of these colonists were from the gentry class, accustomed to giving orders, not tilling the soil. Every man dreamed of striking gold. None were willing to farm. By autumn, only 46 of the original 105 remained alive. Just as the colony teetered on the brink of collapse, John Smith stepped forward. The legendary soldier uttered his famous maxim, asterisk, no work, no food, asterisk. He forced every colonist to labor, and sought to make contact with the Powhatan Confederacy. By his own account, when he was captured by the chief and faced execution, the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, saved his life. No matter how much of the story is legend, it became a bridge between two worlds. The Powhatan taught the colonists to grow corn and identify edible plants. Without their help, Jamestown would have perished long before. Yet the trials were far from over. In 1609, Smith returned to England after an injury, and the colony descended into chaos once more. That winter was brutally cold. Food ran out, and the colonists resorted to eating rats, snakes, and even human flesh. Records tell of a man who killed his pregnant wife and salted her flesh for food. When spring arrived, only 60 of the 500 colonists were still alive. They resolved to abandon the settlement. But just as they prepared to set sail, the new governor, Thomas West, Baron Delaware, arrived with supply ships. Jamestown was saved. While the southern colony struggled to survive, a different group of settlers arrived in the north. In 1620, the Mayflower dropped anchor in Plymouth with 102 passengers aboard. They had not come for gold, but for faith. They were Puritan separatists who had fled their homeland because they could not worship freely in England. Before going ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, promising to form a civil body politic and enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. This became the first cornerstone of America's tradition of democratic self-governance. Half the settlers died in the first winter, but they met Squanto, a Patuxet man who spoke English. He had been kidnapped and enslaved in Europe, yet after escaping, he did not turn to hatred. Instead, he taught the Puritans to fish, fertilize their crops, and survive the land. After the harvest, they celebrated together, the origin of Thanksgiving. Yet the harmony was soon broken. As waves of immigrants arrived, their hunger for land overrode all else. In 1675, Metacamet chief of the Wampanoag launched King Philip's War, the bloodiest conflict in New England's history. In the end, he was defeated and killed, his wife and children sold into slavery, and indigenous power in New England was utterly destroyed. By 1700, the framework of the 13 colonies was largely in place. New England, shaped by Puritan ethics, built its economy on fishing and shipbuilding. The middle colonies, such as New York and Pennsylvania, were a tapestry of multiculturalism, with Philadelphia emerging as the most tolerant city, thanks to its promise of religious freedom. The South was a world apart. Vast plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with tobacco and rice, all sustained by the labor of enslaved Africans. The triangular trade carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved people, who were then shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas. The slave ships were floating hells, where countless Africans died and were thrown into the sea. Slavery, this cancer on the nation, would go on to tear at its soul for centuries to come. All 13 colonies were subjects of the British Crown. All spoke English. All enjoyed a degree of self-governance, with each colony having its own legislature, fostering a tradition of representative government. Most importantly, a unique American identity was beginning to take root. Social hierarchies were far less rigid than in Europe. Artisans could live a decent life, and the farmer's son could own his own land. Yet a rift was growing between the colonies and the mother country, and a global war would soon turn these undercurrents into a tidal wave. In 1754, a 22-year-old Virginia militia officer named George Washington fired on a French scouting party in the Ohio River Valley, lighting the fuse of the 7 Years' War. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian War, and its root cause was land. The colonial population had surpassed 1 million, and with coastal land exhausted, settlers began crossing the Appalachian Mountains land, the French claimed, as their own. Most indigenous nations sided with the French, for the French had come primarily to trade, not to seize land and settle it, unlike the British. In the early stages of the war, British regular troops suffered devastating defeats in the American wilderness. In 1755, General Edward Braddock led nearly 2,000 men on a march to Fort Duquesne. Washington repeatedly urged him to adopt guerrilla tactics, but the arrogant general ignored the advice. The result was an ambush on the banks of the Monongahela River, where British troops were mowed down like targets. Braddock was killed in the battle. This crushing defeat shattered the colonists' faith in the British military. The turning point came in 1758, when Prime Minister William Pitt resolved to win the war, pouring vast resources into the conflict. In 1759, General James Wolfe led his men under cover of night to scale the cliffs below Quebec City, forming battle lines on the Plains of Abraham. Both commanding generals were killed in the fighting, but the British emerged victorious. The fall of Quebec marked the end of French rule in North America. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, in which France ceded Canada and all territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Yet the joy of victory was short-lived. The war had been enormously costly, doubling Britain's national debt. London believed the colonies should shoulder part of the burden, and a series of tax acts followed: the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. This was the first time Britain had levied a direct internal tax on the colonies, requiring that all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards bear a revenue stamp. It enraged the colonists. Asterisk, no taxation without representation. Asterisk became the rallying cry that echoed across all 13 colonies. They argued that as British subjects, they held the right not to be taxed without their consent, and there were no colonial representatives in the British Parliament. Britain countered with a claim of virtual representation, but the colonists refused to accept it. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the Sons of Liberty were formed, organizing marches, boycotts of British goods, and even violent resistance. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered, their homes burned to the ground. Faced with widespread opposition, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but followed it with the Declaratory Act, which claimed Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. After a brief calm, conflict escalated once more. In 1767, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend imposed new taxes on tea, paper, glass, and other goods. The colonies again launched boycotts, and smuggling of British goods became rampant. In 1768, Britain sent troops to Boston to maintain order. On the night of March 5, 1770, an angry mob of colonists surrounded British soldiers, throwing snowballs and rocks. In the chaos, the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 civilians. This became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere created an engraving depicting the event as a deliberate slaughter by British troops, stoking anti-British sentiment across the colonies. Ironically, in the subsequent trial, future President John Adams defended the British soldiers, arguing that upholding justice and the rule of law was more important than pandering to public opinion. In the end, most of the soldiers were acquitted. In 1773, the British East India Company was on the brink of financial collapse, and Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting it a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies, allowing it to sell tea at a price even lower than smuggled tea. The British believed the cheap tea would appease the colonists, but they were wrong. The colonists saw it as a plot to bribe them into abandoning their principles. On the night of December 16th, Boston colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded British tea ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This was the Boston Tea Party. King George III was furious. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor, revoking Massachusetts' right to self-governance, and allowing British troops to be quartered in private homes. These acts threatened the liberty of every colony, and the colonists realized they must stand united. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Patrick Henry declared, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." The Congress voted to boycott British goods, and recommended that each colony organize its own militia. A center of power parallel to the British Parliament was quietly taking shape. British General Thomas Gage decided to strike first. On the night of April 18, 1775, he sent 700 British troops to Concord, with orders to seize and destroy colonial weapons, caches, and arrest rebel leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the Patriots' intelligence network was efficient. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the night to warn that the British are coming, rousing the colonial militiamen, known as Minutemen, to assemble. On the morning of April 19th, the British troops arrived in Lexington to find 77 Minutemen lined up on the village green. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. Both sides exchanged fire, and 8 Minutemen fell dead. This was the first bloodshed of the Revolutionary War. The British faced far heavier resistance in Concord, and were forced to retreat back to Boston, under constant fire from militiamen along the way. By the end of the day, the British had suffered 273 casualties, the Americans 95. The war had begun. News spread like wildfire across the 13 colonies, and militiamen flooded into Boston, laying siege to the British garrison. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. The delegates faced a fateful choice. Was this an uprising to demand rights within the British Empire, or a war to win full independence? Most still hoped for reconciliation, sending the olive branch petition to King George III, while at the same time appointing George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He was chosen not only for his military experience, but because he was from the South, a critical factor in uniting the colonies. In June, colonial militiamen clashed with British troops at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British charged 3 times, seizing the position only after suffering more than 1,000 casualties. This victory taught the British that suppressing the rebellion would come at an unimaginable cost. In early 1776, King George III rejected the olive branch petition, formally declaring the colonies in a state of rebellion, and hiring German Hessian mercenaries to crush the uprising. All hope of reconciliation was lost. It was at this moment that Thomas Paine's pamphlet *Common Sense* spread like wildfire through the colonies. In plain, passionate language, he denounced monarchy, asking, "How can a small island rule a continent?" He called for full independence and the creation of a republican government. The pamphlet was read by nearly every colonist, turning the idea of independence from a fringe minority view into a popular consensus. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution to the Congress, declaring that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. The Congress appointed a 5-man committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, with the primary author being 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson. Deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought, he wrote the immortal words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He replaced John Locke's right to property with the pursuit of happiness, planting the seed of the American dream. The Declaration listed 27 grievances against King George III, and concluded with a solemn proclamation that the 13 colonies were, from that day forward, free from British rule. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. This day became America's birthday. Celebrations erupted across the colonies, and statues of King George III were torn down. Yet after the jubilation, a harsh reality lay ahead. They had declared war on the most powerful empire in the world. Britain had an invincible navy, a well-trained standing army, and vast financial resources. What did America have? Ill-trained militiamen, no navy, no allies. It was a gamble that seemed almost certain to fail. But there was no turning back. It was either independence or the gallows. In the early stages of the war, American forces suffered defeat after defeat. In the summer of 1776, the British fleet appeared outside New York Harbor, more than 400 warships carrying 32,000 soldiers, the largest British expeditionary force ever deployed overseas. Washington's Continental Army numbered fewer than 20,000 men, poorly equipped and poorly supplied. The Battle of Long Island ended in a devastating American defeat, with the Continental Army trapped in Brooklyn, its back to the East River, facing total annihilation. It was in this moment of despair that Washington showed extraordinary leadership. On Christmas night, he led his ragged army across the ice-choked Delaware River, launching a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. This bold victory did more than anything to boost the army's flagging morale. The true turning point came in 1777. The British had devised a plan to march south from Canada and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. But the isolated British force was surrounded at Saratoga. After fierce fighting, General John Burgoyne surrendered with more than 5,000 men. News of the American victory at Saratoga reached Europe and transformed the international landscape. France, seeing an opportunity to defeat its longtime rival Britain, formally recognized American independence and forged a military alliance with the United States. Spain and the Netherlands soon joined the war against Britain as well. America was no longer fighting alone. The war had become a global conflict, and French aid would be critical to America's ultimate victory. The final showdown came in 1781. The main British army, led by General Charles Cornwallis, was entrenched in Yorktown, Virginia. Washington, in coordination with French forces, surrounded the city. The French fleet defeated British reinforcements in the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis' escape by sea. Under relentless bombardment from the combined American and French forces, Cornwallis had nowhere to turn. He surrendered on October 19, 1781. As the British military band played Asterisk, the world turned upside down. Asterisk. Many onlookers felt the song could not have been more fitting. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. A brand new nation was born. Yet independence was only the first step. The greater question was how to govern itself. The initial framework, the Articles of Confederation, created a loose alliance of sovereign states, with a weak central government that lacked even the power to levy taxes or maintain a standing army. Each state acted in its own interests, and the nation descended into economic chaos. In 1786, Shays' Rebellion broke out in Massachusetts, exposing the utter incompetence of the Confederation government. The nation seemed to be sliding into the abyss of division. In 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia, ostensibly to amend the Articles of Confederation. In reality, they resolved to create an entirely new federal government. The convention was marked by fierce debate. Large and small states clashed over representation in Congress, while northern and southern states stood deadlocked over the issue of slavery. In the end, a series of brilliant compromises brought the delegates together. A bicameral Congress was created, the House of Representatives, with seats allocated by population, satisfying the large states, and the Senate, with 2 seats for every state, appeasing the small states. This became known as the Connecticut Compromise. On slavery, the delegates reached the 3/5 Compromise, which stipulated that for the purposes of representation and taxation, an enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a free person. These compromises held the Union together for a time, but planted the seeds for the Civil War decades later. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed the new United States Constitution. It established the separation of powers, the Congress to make laws, the President to enforce them, and the Supreme Court to interpret them. It created a powerful, popularly elected president. To secure ratification of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, defending the new framework. Anti-Federalists feared a strong central government would infringe on individual liberties, and demanded a Bill of Rights as a condition for ratification. The Federalists promised to add amendments protecting the rights of citizens. The Constitution went into effect in 1788, and in 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. That same year, Congress proposed the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. the Bill of Rights, which were ratified in 1791, guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and the right to bear arms, among other fundamental liberties. The United States was transformed from a loose alliance of states into a unified constitutional republic. Over his 8 years as president, Washington set countless precedents. He maintained neutrality in foreign affairs, mediated bitter political divides, and turned the Constitution from words on a page into a functioning government. In 1797, he voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, peacefully transferring power to his successor, John Adams. It was an act that shocked the world, where power had always changed hands through coup or violence. Washington had proven that a republic could govern itself peacefully and stably. Yet, even as Washington left office, partisan politics was already taking root. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton advocated for a strong central government and the development of industry and commerce, led by the nation's elite. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson championed an agrarian society, limited government, and sympathized deeply with the French Revolution. The foundations of America's two-party system were laid. The election of 1800, often called the Revolution of 1800, marked the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in American history, when Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams to become the 3rd president. He pursued a policy of limited government and cut federal spending, but his greatest achievement was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte, desperate for cash to fund his wars in Europe, sold the 828,000 square mile Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million, doubling the size of the country overnight. Jefferson dispatched the Lewis and Clark expedition, which set out from the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, reached the Pacific Ocean, mapping the land, documenting its flora and fauna, and engaging with indigenous nations, laying the groundwork for westward expansion. Yet Jefferson soon faced harsh realities. As Britain and France waged war across Europe, the United States struggled to remain neutral. The British Royal Navy boarded American merchant ships to capture deserters, many of whom were in fact American citizens, to force the European powers to respect American neutrality. Jefferson signed the Embargo Act of 1807, banning all trade with Europe. Intended as economic sanctions to avoid war, it instead devastated the American economy, and Jefferson's popularity plummeted. In 1808, he honored the 2-term precedent and stepped down, handing the presidency to his Secretary of State, James Madison. Madison inherited a crisis, as British harassment only intensified, and the British began arming indigenous tribes to attack American frontier settlements. In 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, in what became known as the War of 1812, or the Second War of Independence. In the early stages of the war, the United States was woefully unprepared. An invasion of Canada ended in humiliating defeat, and New England even refused to send troops to fight. In 1814, after Napoleon's defeat in Europe, Britain was able to concentrate its military forces on the war in America. A British army captured Washington, D.C., burning the White House and the U.S. Capitol to the ground. First Lady Dolly Madison rescued the iconic portrait of George Washington before fleeing the White House, becoming a hero in the nation's memory. By the end of the year, however, the war took a dramatic turn. In New Orleans, Andrew Jackson led a ragtag army of militiamen, pirates, and free black men to a stunning, lopsided victory over the British. The triumph electrified the nation. Ironically, the battle was fought after the United States and Britain had already signed a peace treaty in Ghent, Belgium, news of which had not yet arrived due to the slow communications of the era. But this belated victory forged a national myth of overcoming a mighty enemy. The Treaty of Ghent restored the pre-war status quo, with no territorial changes for either side. Though there was no clear winner of the war, it ignited a fierce sense of national pride in the United States. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, collapsed and faded from history, leaving the Democratic Republican Party as the dominant political force. The federal system began to function stably. In 1823, President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, warning European powers not to interfere in the affairs of the Americas, declaring that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Though the United States lacked the military strength to enforce it at the time, it laid out the nation's ambition to claim the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence. Domestically, as the nation expanded westward, the question of slavery re-emerged with a vengeance. The South's economy was entirely dependent on enslaved labor for its cotton plantations, while the North was rapidly industrializing. The conflict between these two systems grew more acute by the day. To maintain the fragile balance of power in Congress, the Missouri Compromise was passed in 1820, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the equal number of slave and free states in the Senate. It also drew a line at 3,630 feet north latitude, banning slavery in all new territories north of the line. It was a tenuous truce, and one that planted the seeds for future conflict. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected president, hailed as the people's president. He pursued aggressive policies, particularly toward indigenous peoples. He pushed through the Indian Removal Act, forcing the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast to relocate to lands west of the Mississippi River. This tragic forced march became known to the Cherokee people as the Trail of Tears. Tens of thousands died of disease, starvation, and exposure along the way. One of the darkest chapters in America's history of expansion. In the 1830s, the nation's borders continued to expand. Texas, originally part of Mexico, declared independence in 1836 after a flood of American settlers arrived, forming the Republic of Texas. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas. The ideology of manifest destiny took hold. The belief that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch across the North American continent, spreading democracy and civilization. The annexation enraged Mexico. President James K. Polk was a fervent expansionist who wanted not just Texas, but California and New Mexico as well. In 1846, he sent American troops into the disputed border region, triggering the Mexican-American War. American forces swept through Mexico, even capturing Mexico City itself. In 1848, Mexico was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and New Mexico to the United States, in exchange for $15 million. Overnight, the United States became a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Yet the victory brought with it an even deeper divide. Northerners demanded to know, would the new territories be slave states or free states? In 1850, California, its population having exploded after the gold rush, applied to join the Union as a free state, upsetting the delicate balance between North and South. To defuse the crisis, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. Its most infamous provision was the Fugitive Slave Act, which required northern states to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people to the South, effectively imposing slavery on the free states. Many Northerners were outraged and ashamed, and began openly defying the law, helping enslaved people escape to Canada via the Underground Railroad. The abolitionist movement flourished across the North. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper The Liberator called for the immediate and total abolition of slavery. Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man, used his own life story to expose the horrors of slavery to the nation. Harriet Tubman repeatedly snuck into the South, leading hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that vividly depicted the evils of slavery, bringing millions of Northern readers to tears and galvanizing public opinion against slavery. It is said that when Abraham Lincoln later met Stowe, he remarked, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war?" In 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed the settlers of new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, repealing the Missouri Compromise line and opening the entire West to slaveholders. After the act was passed, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, leading to rampant election fraud, violence, and bloodshed. Bleeding Kansas became a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, declaring that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in federal territories. The decision enraged the North, convincing many that ending slavery through legal means was no longer possible. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln, in his campaign against Douglas for a U.S. Senate seat, delivered his famous House Divided speech, declaring, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing, or all the other." Though he lost the election, the speech made him a national figure. In 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown raided the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to arm enslaved people and launch a nationwide uprising. He was captured, tried, and executed. The North hailed him as a martyr. The South denounced him as a terrorist. The nation was stretched to breaking point. In the 1860 presidential election, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Though he did not advocate for its immediate abolition in the South, the Democratic Party split, fielding 2 separate candidates, one from the North and one from the South. In the end, Lincoln won the election without receiving a single electoral vote from the Deep South. For the South, this meant that their way of life and economic foundation faced an existential threat. In December 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed. In February 1861, the 7 seceded states formed the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. The Confederacy enshrined the protection of slavery in its constitution and championed the supremacy of states' rights over the federal government. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated as president. He stated that he had no intention of interfering with slavery in the southern states, but that the permanent division of the Union was impossible. He called for peace, but the South was already resolved to fight. In the early hours of April 12, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. After 34 hours of bombardment, the Union garrison surrendered. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, prompting for more southern states to secede and join the Confederacy. The United States descended into 4 years of bloody civil war. In the early stages of the war, the South held a clear advantage. It had far more gifted military commanders, such as Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and its soldiers were fighting to defend their homes with high morale. The North held overwhelming advantages in population, industry, and resources, but its generals were mediocre, and its strategy was muddled. In July 1861, the first Battle of Bull Run, Manassas was fought. Many Washington elites brought picnic baskets to watch the battle, expecting a quick Union victory, only to watch in horror as the Union Army fled in disarray back to the capital. It was a brutal wake-up call that this would be a long, brutal war. Lincoln appointed George B. McClellan to reorganize the army. McClellan was a brilliant organizer, but cripplingly cautious, always overestimating the size of enemy forces and refusing to attack. In the spring of 1862, he launched an offensive against the Confederate capital of Richmond, but was driven back by Lee in the Peninsula Campaign. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, General Ulysses S. Grant emerged as a formidable leader, winning a series of victories with bold tactics, seizing Confederate forts and cutting off the South's access to the Mississippi River. In April, at the Battle of Shiloh, Grant held off a surprise Confederate attack and won a devastatingly costly victory. In September 1862, Lee invaded the North, hoping to bring the war to Union soil. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Antietam. It remains the single bloodiest day in American military history, with over 23,000 casualties. The Union Army held the field, forcing Lee to retreat back to Virginia. Though it was a tactical draw, it was a major strategic victory for Lincoln. He seized the moment, and on September 22nd, issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1, 1863, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory forever free. Though it could not immediately free enslaved people in the heart of the Confederacy, it transformed the nature of the war, from a fight to preserve the Union to a fight for human freedom. It galvanized Northern morale, and ensured that Britain and France would not recognize or support the Confederacy. After the proclamation was issued, nearly 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army, making an enormous contribution to the Union victory. The Union also passed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, encouraging westward expansion. The South, meanwhile, was crippled by the Union naval blockade, its economy collapsing, and its social order unraveling. In the summer of 1863, the war reached its decisive turning point. In the West, Grant laid siege to Vicksburg for 47 days, before the Confederate garrison surrendered. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in two. At almost the same time, Lee again invaded the North, hoping to turn the tide of the war. His army met fierce Union resistance at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. After 3 days of brutal fighting, Pickett's charge, the Confederacy's desperate final assault, was decimated, and Lee was forced to retreat. The Battle of Gettysburg marked the end of the South's ability to launch strategic offensives, and became the defining turning point of the Civil War. Months after the battle, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery and delivered the Gettysburg Address. In just 2 minutes, he delivered an immortal speech, declaring that the war was testing whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure. He called on the nation to dedicate itself to the unfinished work of the fallen soldiers, and vowed that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The speech gave the war its highest moral meaning, and bound the North together in its cause. In 1864, Lincoln was re-elected, and the war entered its final phase of total Union domination. He appointed Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant adopted a strategy of total war, with the goal not just of defeating Confederate armies, but of destroying the South's will to fight and its economic ability to wage war. He personally led the main Union Army in Virginia, launching a series of costly offensives against Lee's forces outside Richmond, suffering horrific casualties, but relentlessly closing in on the Confederate capital. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman set out from Atlanta on his march to the sea, his army cutting a swath of destruction through the heart of Georgia to the port of Savannah. burning plantations, destroying railroads, seizing food supplies, and turning the economic heart of the Confederacy to scorched earth. His logic was unflinching. War is hell, and only by instilling fear and despair in the South could its resistance be broken. In April 1865, Richmond fell to Union forces. On April 9th, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant offered generous terms. He allowed Confederate officers to keep their sidearms and horses, and provided rations for the starving Confederate soldiers, hoping that the former enemies would once again become fellow citizens. Yet, as the nation celebrated the return of peace, tragedy struck. On the night of April 14th, Lincoln was shot and mortally wounded by the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater. He never lived to see the completion of Reconstruction and died a martyr for the Union and freedom, becoming one of the most revered presidents in American history. The Civil War killed more than 620,000 Americans, making it the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. It ended slavery and fundamentally reshaped the structure of the United States. America was no longer a loose alliance of states, but an indivisible, sovereign nation. Black Americans were now legally free, but true equality would require a century more of struggle. How to treat the defeated South became the defining question of the post-war era. Lincoln had advocated for a moderate Reconstruction plan, the 10% plan, which would allow a southern state to rejoin the Union once 10% of its voters swore an oath of allegiance to the United States. But the radical Republicans in Congress believed this was far too lenient, and sought to completely restructure Southern society and guarantee the rights of Black Americans. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, formally abolishing slavery throughout the United States. But Southern states quickly passed the Black Codes, a series of laws designed to keep Black Americans trapped in a state of near slavery on plantations. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act over the veto of President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, who was deeply hostile to Black civil rights. Congress also proposed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all people born in the United States and guaranteed equal protection under the law. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the South into 5 military districts under the control of the U.S. Army, and requiring the states to draft new constitutions guaranteeing Black men the right to vote under the protection of federal troops. The South saw an unprecedented political awakening. Thousands of Black Americans voted for the first time, and many were elected to state legislatures and the U.S. Congress. It was an era of hope, of radical Reconstruction. But it also ignited ferocious white supremacist backlash across the South. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, a secret white supremacist organization, emerged, its members wearing white hoods and robes, terrorizing Black communities under cover of night, using intimidation, beatings, and lynching to stop Black Americans from voting. Faced with this relentless violence, many Black Americans were forced to abandon their political rights. In 1877, to resolve a bitterly disputed presidential election, Republicans and Democrats struck the compromise of 1877. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would be awarded the presidency in exchange for the full withdrawal of all federal troops from the South. With the troops gone, white Southern Democrats quickly seized back power, passing a series of laws that used poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to systematically strip Black Americans of their right to vote. The Jim Crow system of racial segregation was enshrined in law. Reconstruction had failed. Black Americans were plunged into nearly a century of state-enforced segregation, a dark era of legal equality that was, in reality, brutal inequality. The smoke of the Civil War had cleared, but the nation's wounds were far from healed. By the end of the 19th century, America's gaze turned beyond its own borders. The Industrial Revolution had swept across the nation, as steel, oil, and railroad tycoons amassed staggering fortunes. The country needed new markets, raw materials, and strategic military outposts, and began to talk of sea power and overseas expansion. It was about to embark on the path to empire. Its first target was Hawaii. The islands had been an independent kingdom, but American missionaries and white sugar planters had come to dominate the island's economy. In 1893, with the tacit approval of the U.S. government, the planters launched a coup, overthrowing Queen Liliuokalani, with U.S. Marines landing to seize control of the capital. President Grover Cleveland believed the coup was illegal and demanded the Queen be restored to the throne, but the provisional government refused. The stalemate lasted until 1898, when the expansionist president, William McKinley, took office, convinced of Hawaii's critical strategic value, particularly after the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. The United States formally annexed Hawaii that year. The Spanish-American War was ignited by Cuba. Cuba had long been a Spanish colony, and repeated uprisings by the Cuban people had been brutally crushed by Spanish forces. American yellow journalism sensationalized Spanish atrocities, whipping up public fury against Spain. In February 1898, the USS Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. Though the cause of the explosion was never determined, the American public blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the national rallying cry. Under immense public pressure, McKinley asked Congress to declare war. The war was brief and one-sided. Commodore George Dewey destroyed the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet in Manila Bay in just 7 hours. In Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt led his Rough Riders in the famous charge up San Juan Hill, opening the way to Santiago de Cuba. Spain was quickly defeated. The Treaty of Paris forced Spain to renounce all sovereignty over Cuba, which became a U.S. protectorate, and cede Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, in exchange for $20 million. Overnight, the United States was transformed from a continental nation into a global empire with overseas colonies. Yet in the Philippines, Filipino independence fighters, who had fought against Spain, realized they had merely exchanged one colonial master for another, and launched a war against the United States. The 3-year Philippine-American War killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, and sparked fierce debate at home, with prominent figures, including Mark Twain, publicly condemning America's imperialist actions. At the dawn of the 20th century, America underwent a profound social transformation at home. Industrialization had brought unprecedented wealth, but also staggering inequality. Cities were filled with overcrowded slums, and child laborers and women worked in horrific conditions in factories. The progressive movement swept across the nation. Muckraking journalists exposed corporate corruption, the unsanitary conditions of the food industry, and political scandals. President Theodore Roosevelt was the face of the progressive era, using what he called the bully pulpit of the presidency to launch a fierce antitrust campaign. Filing lawsuits against more than 40 major corporations, he established the National Park System to protect America's wilderness, and pushed through landmark food and drug safety legislation. His famous motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," embodied both his reformist spirit at home and his aggressive foreign policy abroad. In 1914, the Great War broke out in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson declared American neutrality, and most Americans hoped to stay out of the conflicts of the Old World. But the war had a profound impact on America's economic interests. American banks issued massive loans to the Allied powers, and factories churned out war supplies. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare sank American merchant ships, killing American citizens. In 1917, the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted, in which Germany promised to help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if it joined the war against the United States. The telegram enraged the American public. In April, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. More than 2 million American troops were sent to France, giving the Allied powers a decisive advantage. In battles such as the Marne and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American troops, with their high morale and enormous sacrifices, turned the tide of the war. On November 11, 1918, Germany surrendered. More than 116,000 American soldiers had died in the war, a far smaller loss than that suffered by the European powers. Wilson traveled to Paris for the peace conference, where he put forward his 14 points, advocating for national self-determination, open diplomacy, and the creation of a League of Nations to maintain world peace. But the European powers were far more concerned with punishing Germany and seizing its colonies. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh, crippling terms on Germany, planting the seeds for a second global conflict. The Covenant of the League of Nations was included in the treaty, but in a bitter irony, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it, and the United States never joined the League. Wilson traveled across the country giving speeches to rally support for the League, but suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed. The United States turned back toward isolationism. The 1920s were a decade of wild optimism and frenetic excess in America. The war was over, the economy was booming, and the stock market soared to unprecedented heights. Henry Ford's Model T brought the automobile within reach of ordinary families, and the assembly line revolutionized manufacturing. Radio and motion pictures became mass entertainment, and Hollywood created a world of dreams and glamour. It was the Roaring '20s, a time when young people defied traditional social norms and embraced new fashions and lifestyles. But beneath the prosperity lay deep fault lines. Prohibition had created a thriving black market and the rise of organized crime, making gangsters like Al Capone infamous. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a massive resurgence, with membership reaching 4 million, spreading hatred against black Americans, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1924 severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and banned immigration from Asia entirely, reflecting a rising tide of xenophobia and nativism. Economically, reckless speculation on the stock market, extreme concentration of wealth, and a deepening agricultural depression left the economy dangerously fragile. In October 1929, The Wall Street crash arrived on Black Tuesday. In the years that followed, the Great Depression swept across the nation. Banks collapsed, businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment soared to 25%, leaving 13 million Americans out of work. People lined up for bread in soup kitchens, and Hoovervilles, shantytowns, built from scrap materials, sprang up across the country. Named for the unpopular President Herbert Hoover. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York, was elected president in a landslide. Born into a wealthy aristocratic family, he had been stricken with polio as an adult, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The experience gave him a profound understanding of the suffering of ordinary Americans. On March 4, 1933, in his inaugural address, he declared to the nation, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt launched an unprecedented wave of legislation, known as the New Deal. He moved quickly to stabilize and reform the banking system, restoring public confidence in the financial system. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put millions of young men to work, planting trees and building public works. He pushed through the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act, stabilizing farm prices and setting standards for wages and working conditions. He launched massive public works projects, building roads, bridges, schools, and infrastructure across the country. Through his fireside chats, he spoke directly to the American people via radio, explaining his policies and giving hope to a nation in despair. The New Deal evolved from relief to fundamental reform. In 1935, the Social Security Act was passed, creating the nation's first national system of old age pensions and unemployment insurance, a federal safety net for all Americans. The Wagner Act protected the right of workers to form labor unions and bargain collectively. The Tennessee Valley Authority TVA was a bold experiment, with the federal government building dams and power plants across the impoverished Tennessee Valley, bringing electricity and economic development to one of the poorest regions of the country. The New Deal did not fully end the Great Depression. It was the massive military production of World War II that finally eliminated unemployment. But it fundamentally transformed the role of the American government, from a laissez-faire night watchman state to an active manager of the economy and guarantor of social welfare. For his achievements, Roosevelt became the only president in American history to be elected to 4 terms. December 7, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 4 battleships were sunk, nearly 2,000 aircraft destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans killed. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy soon declared war on the United States, and America was fully drawn into World War II. The war unleashed the full industrial might of the United States. Factories operated 24 hours a day, producing an endless stream of tanks, aircraft, and warships. Millions of women left their homes to work in factories, becoming Rosie the Riveter, the iconic symbol of the home front war effort. The war also accelerated the civil rights movement to secure the support of black soldiers. Roosevelt signed an executive order banning racial discrimination in the defense industry. More than 1 million black Americans served in the military during the war, even as most were assigned to segregated units. They had fought for freedom overseas, and returned home more determined than ever to demand true freedom and equality in their own country. In the European theater, American and Allied troops landed in North Africa, then invaded Italy. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy opened the Second Front in Western Europe. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. military adopted an island-hopping campaign, steadily advancing toward the Japanese home islands. In April 1945, Roosevelt died suddenly, and Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in as president. In May, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In August, to force Japan's rapid surrender and avoid the massive casualties of a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, Truman ordered the dropping of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after. World War II ended with the United States as the only major combatant whose homeland was untouched by the war, emerging as the most powerful nation on Earth. With more than half of the world's industrial capacity, 2/3 of its gold reserves, and a monopoly on the atomic bomb. Yet the joy of victory was quickly replaced by a new fear. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, became its new adversary. Ideological rivalry and geopolitical competition dragged the world into 4 decades of the Cold War. In 1947, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, promising American aid to nations resisting communist expansion. It was followed by the Marshall Plan, which provided more than $13 billion in aid to Western Europe to rebuild its war-torn economies and stem the spread of communism, to counter the Soviet Union. The United States led the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO in 1949. The Soviet Union responded with the creation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The world was now sharply divided into two opposing blocs. At home, fear of communism evolved into McCarthyism, a wave of political repression and paranoia. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that hundreds of communist spies and sympathizers had infiltrated the U.S. government, launching a witch hunt that ruined the careers and reputations of countless innocent Americans. The hysteria only began to subside in 1954, after McCarthy's reckless accusations were exposed in televised Senate hearings. The Cold War soon spilled over into open conflict. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. The United States led a United Nations military force to intervene, fighting against North Korean and Chinese troops. The war descended into a bloody stalemate, and an armistice was signed in 1953, leaving the Korean peninsula divided to this day. The war cost the lives of more than 30,000 American soldiers, and taught the world the devastating cost of war in the nuclear age. The 1950s saw America enjoy unprecedented post-war prosperity. Suburbanization boomed, and nearly every family owned a car and a television. But beneath the calm surface, the civil rights movement was gathering momentum. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine that had upheld segregation for decades. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a black woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for more than a year. A young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the leader of the boycott, advocating for nonviolent resistance, using the power of moral courage to fight injustice. The 1960s marked the height of the civil rights movement. College students organized freedom rides to challenge racial segregation on interstate buses and in bus terminals across the South. In Birmingham, Alabama, police used attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses against peaceful child protesters, images that shocked the world. In 1963, 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. These efforts led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial segregation in public places and outlawed employment discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated the discriminatory laws that had stripped black Americans of their right to vote for decades. Yet the nation's social divides only deepened. In the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War escalated dramatically. The United States became trapped in a bloody quagmire, with casualties mounting by the day, and no end to the war in sight. The anti-war movement swept across the nation, with young people chanting, "Make love, not war." 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in American history. Martin Luther King Jr. and presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy were both assassinated, and riots erupted in cities across the country. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, police violently clashed with anti-war protesters, and the nation seemed on the brink of collapse. The 1970s saw America mired in stagflation, with high inflation and high unemployment crippling the economy. The oil crisis led to long lines at gas stations across the country. In 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned from office over the Watergate scandal, the first and only president in American history to resign. The scandal shattered the American public's trust in their government. In 1980, former California Governor Ronald Reagan was elected president. He advocated for tax cuts, deregulation of industry, and a massive military buildup to confront the Soviet Union. His optimistic, unapologetically patriotic rhetoric and hardline anti-communist stance reignited American confidence. During his presidency, the economy recovered, and the arms race with the Soviet Union reached its peak. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over, and the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s saw America reap the peace dividend of the Cold War's end. Economic globalization accelerated, and the internet revolution took hold, with Silicon Valley becoming the global center of innovation. But the world was far from peaceful. In 1991, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the United States led a multinational coalition in the Gulf War, swiftly defeating the Iraqi military. In 1999, NATO launched an air war against Yugoslavia over the Kosovo crisis, the first time the United States had waged a war without the authorization of the United Nations. On September 11, 2001, everything changed. 4 hijacked commercial airliners were crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. In New York City and the Pentagon outside Washington, D.C., nearly 3,000 people were killed. It was the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil in history, leaving the nation shocked and enraged. President George W. Bush vowed to bring the terrorists to justice, launching the global war on terror. U.S. forces quickly overthrew the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, but the war soon descended into a decades-long quagmire. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, claiming that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and waging the war without the authorization of the United Nations. The Saddam regime was quickly overthrown, but the alleged WMDs were never found. Iraq descended into years of brutal civil war and sectarian violence, giving rise to the Islamic State. These two endless wars drained trillions of dollars from the U.S. Treasury, cost the lives of thousands of American soldiers, and severely damaged America's international reputation. Domestically, the USA Patriot Act, passed in the wake of 9/11s, vastly expanded the government's surveillance powers, sparking widespread concerns about the erosion of civil liberties and privacy. In 2008, a financial crisis that originated in the U.S. housing market swept across the globe. Lehman Brothers collapsed, the stock market crashed, and the world descended into the worst recession since the Great Depression. The crisis exposed the deep fragility of the global financial system and exacerbated soaring economic inequality in the United States. In the second decade of the 21st century, the rise of China made the United States acutely aware that the unipolar moment had ended. President Barack Obama announced the pivot to Asia, seeking to reorient America's strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific. Yet the Arab Spring in the Middle East devolved into long-running conflicts, including the Syrian civil war, leaving the United States struggling to manage the chaos. At the same time, political polarization in America grew increasingly severe, and the nation's social consensus continued to collapse. In 2016, real estate developer Donald Trump was elected president in a stunning upset. Running on the slogan, "Make America Great Again," he pursued an America First foreign policy, withdrawing the United States from numerous international agreements and deepening the nation's bitter political divides. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, and the United States became one of the hardest-hit countries in the world, with its economy and society devastated, and more than 1 million Americans losing their lives. That same year, the murder of George Floyd, a black man, by a white police officer in Minneapolis, sparked nationwide Black Lives Matter BLM protests. The issue of race remained the deepest, unhealed wound in the nation's soul. In the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump to become president, but Trump refused to concede defeat, making baseless claims of widespread election fraud. His lies ultimately incited the January 6, 2021 attack on the United States Capitol, when thousands of his supporters stormed the building in an attempt to stop the certification of the election results. The riot left multiple people dead, and marked the first time the Capitol had been breached since the British burned it in 1814. It shocked the world, and laid bare the deep fragility of America's democratic institutions. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The United States led the Western alliance in imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia, and provided hundreds of billions of dollars in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The conflict was widely seen as the most serious geopolitical crisis since the end of the Cold War, escalating tensions between the United States and Russia, and driving up inflation across the globe. That same year, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, overturning the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision that had guaranteed a constitutional right to abortion for nearly 50 years. The ruling sparked nationwide protests and deepened the nation's bitter social and cultural divides. In 2023, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank triggered a regional banking crisis. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively to curb soaring inflation, leaving the economy teetering on the brink of recession. The artificial intelligence revolution exploded onto the scene, with generative AI tools such as ChatGPT sparking profound anxiety about the future of work and the nature of human labor. At the same time, Donald Trump became the first former president in American history to face criminal indictment, on charges ranging from hush money payments to the mishandling of classified documents, setting the stage for an unprecedented collision between the judicial system and American politics. In the 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump was elected to a second term, becoming the first president in 130 years to win non-consecutive terms in office. He promised to take revenge on his political opponents, launch mass deportations of undocumented immigrants, and impose sweeping tariffs on goods from around the world. The election itself was overshadowed by the threat of political violence, with two failed assassination attempts against Trump during the campaign. Political polarization in the United States had reached its most severe level since the Civil War, and social trust had all but collapsed. From 2025 to the present day, the new administration has moved swiftly to fulfill its campaign promises, withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization, imposing tariffs on dozens of countries and triggering a global trade war, carrying out mass layoffs of federal employees, and drastically tightening immigration enforcement. At the same time, devastating wildfires have raged across California and other western states, with Los Angeles suffering the worst wildfires in its history, destroying thousands of homes and laying bare the urgent threat of the climate crisis. In the technology sector, the global AI arms race has intensified, and space exploration has accelerated at a breakneck pace. Yet domestically, the gap between the rich and poor continues to widen, and the American middle class continues to shrink. Today, the United States stands at a new crossroads. It remains the most powerful nation on Earth, with unparalleled innovative capacity, a rich and diverse culture, and deep democratic traditions. Yet at the same time, it faces profound challenges, crippling political polarization, deep social divides, soaring economic inequality, and the relative decline of its global standing. From the first humans who crossed the Bering Land Bridge tens of thousands of years ago, to the citizens debating fiercely on social media today, the story of this land has always revolved around one central question: how to fulfill the ancient promise, written into its founding documents, that all men are created equal. In a society as vast and diverse as this, that story is still being written.